a question. You touched on how, let's say, technology is advancing so far that people are being pushed out of jobs, so they're not required to work. But if I heard correctly, like sort of the socialist utopia, in a sense, is where work is optional as well. So doesn't that make it sound like capitalism is accomplishing something faster than socialism would in terms of making work not not a requirement because we have through the capitalist model we have machines that say that can do that, versus say the socialist model. And I understand kind of what you're saying in terms of giving people something to do, but just this idea that it would appear that, or maybe the argument could be made that capitalism has more successfully advanced technology than socialist models have.
Well, there's a couple things there. I think the major difference is that under capitalism, if you can't sell your labor power to a boss, you have no means of supporting yourself, right? I mean, that's what kind of the definition of a proletarian, right? The capitalists live by owning. They own banks, they own oil wells, they own airlines, they own TV networks. But the working class, they live by selling their labor power. And if technology advances to the point that they can't sell their labor power, they're going to be poorer and they're going to struggle to get by, and you're going to have unemployment. So the idea of communism, where labor becomes life's prime want, is that there's so much abundance created by technology it creates less of an obligation upon people to work. Is the idea, right? I think that's the difference. But yes, capitalism has greatly advanced technology, but I don't think it's fair to say that socialism hasn't. I mean, again, who invented space travel? Who invented the
Mm-hmm.
AK-47 rifle? Who invented LED lights? There are many great inventions in socialism. And if you look at the 1980s and the computer revolution, the Soviet Union had a lot less resources to invest in their computer research and technology, but even they had great breakthroughs. And many people marveled at the fact they developed their own home computer system in the 1980s. They could have,
Mm-hmm.
if they'd had the ability to mass produce it, they could have had basically the equivalent of what Apple was doing at the time. And this idea that the state and that state planning doesn't create innovation. One of the biggest pet peeves of mine is there's a meme I've seen many times, and it's like it has a picture of an iPhone. It's like, someone with an iPhone, how can they believe in socialism? iPhone's the proof of the greatness of capitalism. Well, the LED screen on your iPhone, that's a Soviet invention, LED lights. The first mobile phone in history was actually patented in 1957 by Leonid Kaprianovich in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And the first satellite, right? If your phone uses satellites for GPS, the first satellite ever launched into orbit was Sputnik, also from the Soviet Union. And if you look at some of the greatest phones, the most efficient phones today are being created by Huawei Technologies, which is technically a private company that's directed by the Chinese government. It's technically a cooperative, like a worker cooperative under Chinese law, but it's basically a wing of the Chinese military. And they're making, smartphones that are much more efficient. So that meme is just completely bunk. I mean, it just depends on people's ignorance of the topic.
Yeah. Now, so if let's say after World War II, I don't know if you would say that like this where the Soviet Union was and where the U.S. was technologically, because they're the two that often get sort of compared, right? That's your capitalist superpower against your communist superpower. I don't know, sort of paradigm people want to compare. And you say, okay, well, the Soviet Union was ahead in terms of, okay, they got the space shuttle and up first. They had a mobile phone or some sort of mobile technology ahead, and so on. How is it then that the US under the capitalist system was able to kind of leap ahead where the Soviet Union crumbled? So what sort of, because people would look at that, I guess they might ask that question, okay, well, why did then the Soviet Union crumble and the US seem to sort of explode in terms of wealth? And I'm asking that question maybe independent of sort of wealth distribution at this point, because I understand that's a problem that we have, and we'll definitely touch on that as well.
Well, I wouldn't say the Soviet Union was ahead. I mean, in terms of life expectancy, they still weren't up at the level the United States had. They still had a lot of regions that were being electrified. And I mean, they weren't ahead of the United States. They were nowhere near the level of technological development the United States had. What was important about the Soviet Union was that they went from 1917 being an agrarian, impoverished, they were basically almost at like the biblical level of development. We're talking like, horse-drawn plows, etc., to being a modern industrial superpower that was capable of repelling a Nazi invasion, capable of inventing space travel, etc. So the fact that they achieved that, that really flies in the face. I mean, you want to get back to psychology and where I came from and such.
Hmm.
I was told my whole life communism doesn't work. Communism just doesn't work. It's never had a single success. It's never achieved anything. Everywhere they've ever tried communism, it's failed. And I remember, getting my hands on some basic economic data. and my jaw dropping when I realized that what everybody knew communism had never achieved anything. No communist country had ever been successful. Only capitalism creates economic growth. Communism just fails everywhere. What I had been told was a lie. I mean, the Soviet Union had achieved real economic miracles. And during the 1930s, when the United States was having a Great Depression, all kinds of engineers and scientists were getting hired to go to the Soviet Union. They built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant. You can read about the achievements that they were having, not just in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of the cultural sphere. They had the music of Shostakovich. They had the films of Sergei Eisenstein, who's considered the father of the montage. This lie that is just pounded into our heads. And I've heard this my whole life. Communism never achieved anything. It's never been successful. It's always failed. This is just a lie. This is simply not true, but it comes up in every discussion. Bernie Sanders, not a communist, not even really a socialist in my view, but he was running on, Medicare for all. And in every conversation, well, they tried that in the Soviet Union and all it resulted in was gulags and death and terror and poverty. This lie, I call it the myth of the 20th century, that socialism has never achieved anything, is just pounded into our heads as part of the discourse in the United States. And it's just a myth. And I think it was realizing that this is such a falsehood, that if anything, that's really what attracted me to learning more about Marxism and socialism.
So then somebody might point to maybe the human cost. So for example, the Soviet, and I'm sure, I'm not presenting anything you haven't been confronted with in terms of people trying to understand this or maybe debate your position, right? But sure. People are going to point their fingers at, okay, yeah, the Russians defeated, say, Nazi Germany, for example, which was quite technologically advanced as well. And I guess, and I'm displaying a little bit of my sort of political ignorance, but I'm going to, they were more of an authoritarian. I don't know. They weren't really necessarily socialist, but they were more of a fascist style. Government controls means of production or through force, but or the marriage of state and industry kind of thing. But the reason that the Russians were, maybe could be argued, were able to defeat the Nazis was not necessarily due to technological superiority, but due to the harsh Russian conditions and just numerical superiority, because they had a population twice that of what Nazi Germany had. So they had the ability to just keep throwing soldiers in the direction until they starved them out in the winter. Is there some accuracy to that in your mind?
Well, my understanding, and again, I'm not a World War II historian, is that, Hitler's hero was Napoleon, and Napoleon had been defeated because of the Russian winter. So Hitler went out of his way to plan to avoid that because he didn't want to fall into that trap. But the Soviet army was something he had not planned, he had not reckoned with. That the Soviet people, they commanded a huge amount of loyalty, and that often, when Hitler had invaded France, when he'd invaded these other countries, you had a lot of governments and a lot of government officials that basically were saying, okay, they're going to roll in. We don't want to have our town turned into a battlefield, and they would just kind of surrender and all of that. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was very much a war of the entire people. And, every old grandma and every young kid and every village and every town was turned into an armed, camp to fight against the Nazis. And the fight against the Nazis of the Soviet Union is something that was marveled about. And in the United States, there was actually a hit song during World War II. It was by an African-American quartet. It was called Stalin Wasn't Stalin. And you can listen to it, and it was kind of cheering.
Really?
Go listen to Stalin Wasn't Stalin. This kind of hit song about cheering for the Soviet Union and their efforts against Hitler. You can go watch. There's a kind of an information newsreel that was made, the Battle of Russia. There's a lot. People were kind of marveling about the Red Army and what they were accomplishing. And yes, the cost in terms of human life was massive. 27 million people died, and the Nazis were absolutely vicious. And they took, very dramatic measures. They moved the population around very significantly, and they moved people around on the basis of their nationality. A lot of Jews were rescued because they knew that if the Nazis got into the area these Jews were, they'd be, sent to the gas chambers. So they moved people around on the basis of their nationality. They moved Jews away from the line. There was also, there were pro-Nazi insurgencies, like in Ukraine with Stepan Bandera, and in Chechnya with some of the Chechen separatist elements. So they moved entire ethnic groups out of the regions where they'd been for thousands of years in order to fight like pro-Nazi insurgency groups. It was kind of, we have no idea. And it is important. You're bringing up the human cost. I want to be absolutely clear that while I admire what the Soviet Union achieved, at the same time, we can't really relate. I don't advocate the
Hmm.
creation of the Soviet political system in the United States or anything like
Right.
that. That would be outrageous. We have no idea the conditions that these people were up against. These
Right.
were very much kill or be killed, desperate conditions of poverty, people fighting for their lives. What I take from it is that, despite everything they were up against, they were able to raise their country up from nothing. They were able to invent space travel and have such great technological achievements. And that shows that we don't need capitalism. We can have a rationally planned socialist
Hmm.
economy. But beyond that, the Soviet Union fell for a reason, and we can get into that later. I'm sure you're going to ask me about that at some point.
Yeah.
But obviously China is not the Soviet Union, and they've adjusted their system to be much more efficient. And there are things we can learn from it. But the fact that the Soviet Union accomplished everything they did and really changed the course of human history. I mean, there wouldn't be a civil rights movement in the United States, really, if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. It was the fact that, before Dr. Martin Luther King, you had the Soviet Union taking a petition to the United Nations, calling out the United States for the racism against African Americans. We charge genocide. When Emmett Till, this young African American man, was murdered, for allegedly whistling at a white woman, the image of his mutilated body, the Soviet Union took that image and sent it all over the world, to Africa and all over the world, and said the USA, they call us a dictatorship and they say they're a democracy. Look what they do to black people. And it was that pressure that was placed on the United States that made, the civil rights movement greatly expand. And I mean, you can talk about a lot of things in the United States. We Americans have directly benefited from the existence of the Soviet Union. I mean, when they talk about the good paying industrial jobs that used to exist in the auto plants and in the steel mills, well, that was because they had militant unions that were created by communists. And those communists leading huge militant strikes during the 1930s and even after the war in the late 1940s, with the Soviet Union existing as kind of their ally, that's what forced, concessions to be granted that created the good wages that once made, Detroit the prosperous motor city it once was, et cetera. So, we Americans have directly benefited from the existence of the Soviet Union. And since the fall of the Soviet Union, our living standards have been going down, right? We've had more privatizations, more cutbacks, et cetera.
Hmm. And so people might they might hear you speak. You're quite young. I asked beforehand because you're youthful looking. You're 34 years old at the time of recording this, and they would think what do you know, being as young as you are as well? You have a limited scope of kind of life experience, and so maybe the question would be then, okay, well, if, and I'm sure you could ask this one too, if, let's say, communism or socialism is so good, why continue to live in the U.S. when there are socialist options out there? And I understand. Let's say it's not necessarily an entirely fair question, but I'm sure you get asked this question: why not go live in these countries if they're such a socialist paradise, so to speak?
Because I love my country, because I'm a patriot, and capitalism is destroying the lives of America's working families. I told you I'm from a small town in Ohio. I believe it's up to 4 people that graduated from high school with me who have died from opioids. And my small town, it's where Smucker's jelly is made. There's like a dairy plant there, and there's also there was a company that made auto parts, and the devastation that they have endured. It was much more prosperous. When I was a kid there in the 90s, it was quite prosperous. But I look at what has happened to my hometown and hometowns like mine all throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and the Rust Belt of the United States, and I see how living conditions are going down. It shows me that the American working people need to realize their enemy is not in Russia. Their enemy is not in China. It's not in Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. Their enemy is on Wall Street. Their enemy is in the Pentagon. And that the future of the American working class is intrinsically tied up with the people of the world, right? There's no independent destiny for American workers. And that ultimately, if we're going to get a better life for the American people, we have to realize that we share a common destiny with people around the world that are struggling for their national liberation and for socialism against Wall Street. And that, sure, for a time, you could argue that imperialism and this global capitalist system where American banks and corporations dominate the world, sure, it benefited average Americans at one point. But now with the computer revolution, and they basically have decided they don't need this, what they used to call the labor aristocracy, or this well-paid layer of industrial workers in the homeland anymore.
That's basically been stripped away altogether.
Yeah, and now is the time for there to be solidarity. And I'm also seeing great signs. The Black Lives Matter movement shows that among millions of white people in the United States realize that racism is no good. They realize that a police state and police state repression and enabling the government to strip away our civil liberties is a bad thing. There's a lot more interracial communities, interracial neighborhoods now, and the ugly curse of racism is starting to be broken down. And many Americans realize that we are headed toward a low-wage police state, that basically the global capitalist system is trying to lead the United States to lower and lower conditions as they set up more of an authoritarian police state apparatus to kind of hold back the millions of people that they no longer have a place for at the assembly line. And I think millions of Americans, Black, white, Arab, Asian, Latino, realize that that they don't want that low-wage police state. And I think that there is a moment of popular mobilization coming. And I think many Americans are going to get involved in the revival of the labor movement that we're seeing with the Amazon workers right now. And the rising unrest is an indicator that this is going to be the time for socialists in the United States, if ever. If I were to go move to Cuba or move to Vietnam, I'd miss the party. I think